Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And hopefully, you're all out there and raring to go for another fantastic history session. Just a little bit of background is to tell you that these sessions are provided by the Voice Cloud via the Rogue Shanty Chorus. Now, the Rogue Shanty Chorus is a fishing choir based in the most easterly town in the UK. For those of you that don't know, that's called Lowestoft in Suffolk. And our guest historian, as always, is the wonderful Ivan Bunn. He's based in Lowestoft, and he's very, very knowledgeable about the town as a whole. But tonight's session will be part 2 of putting Kirkley on the map. It's a subject Ivan's very passionate about, and I'm sure we all are. Now, the Shanty sessions, when they normally happen with our rogues, they happen at Seagull Theatre, which is in Pakefield. And we would tend to meet every other Tuesday and sing our hearts out, sing some fantastic shanties. And we talk a little bit about the history of shanties and the fishing industry within the town itself as well. The reason we've asked Ivan to conduct these history sessions on a Monday evening online is in line with the funding that we very gratefully receive from People's Health Trust, which is part of the Active Communities program. They've been funding us to engage with people of all different ages and all different abilities, and part of that is to make sure that people are engaged with the very broad history of Lowestoft as it is, and in line with that, we've asked Ivan in, and this is now the 8th session that we've been running online. And very popular it's been too. So if anybody is out there with any particular questions about Kirkley, and I know lots of questions came in last week, please do put them in the comments section. We would love to hear them, and I'll put them to Ivan and see what he says. In the meantime, if you'd like to help us further, we would be delighted if you would share this via your own feed. So all your family and friends and acquaintances and work colleagues, anybody that you've got as a friend on Facebook, please do share, and please do comment and let us know what you're thinking, how your memories go with Kirkley or the rest of Lowestoft, or anything that Ivan mentions tonight that brings up a particular point. Please don't hesitate to pop it in a comment. We are also coming to you live tonight, not just on Facebook, but for those of you that don't particularly engage with Facebook, we've been putting these sessions out on YouTube on our channel as well. It's always on a Monday evening from 7:30, and you can choose how you engage with it yourself. But without further delay, would you please welcome our wonderful historian, Mr. Ivan Bunn. Ivan, how are you tonight? You know what? What I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute him first. There we go.
Thank you. I'm fine, thank you, Paul. Welcome everybody to this 8th session that we've done now. I'm getting quite used to talking to a little tiny screen and not seeing anybody. A little bit weird. I've been doing public speaking for 40 years. It's the first time I've ever had to speak to a small screen and can't see my audience, but I'm sure you're all out there, and I've certainly been enjoying this, and I certainly thank Paul and Stephen for inviting me to come along and do these, especially in the worst couple of months, 6 weeks ago, when this lockdown, this isolation, I think was getting to everybody. Fortunately, I think, hopefully, fingers and everything crossed, that we might just be seeing a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel now. But certainly, not only have I enjoyed doing these, but been sort of shut away inside, they've been a little bit of a lifeline for me as well. And I'm grateful to Paul and Stephen to invite me to bend your ears with some of my local history. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. There was no one else really to ask, and by that I don't mean they were all busy. I mean, you're our choice. We've worked with Ivan a little bit in a limited capacity in other projects, on behalf of the Voice Cloud. But when it comes to the Rogue Shanty Chorus, Ivan is, as I say, is the choice. Now we know there's a few people out there watching already. Ivan, one particular candidate is Chris Collins. Apologies, as a bit late tonight. Well, that was 7:33. I think we'll let them off, don't you?
Yeah. Well, hi Chris. I hope you're keeping well.
Fantastic. And what we'll do is in a few minutes we'll head on over to our slideshow, and Ivan will begin his history session. But first off, we were speaking before we came live about what might be on the cards for next week. Ivan, are you able to give us just a bit of a glimpse of that?
Yeah, sure. It's not actually Lowestoft. In the way you could argue that Kirkley is not really Lowestoft either. It's a little bit of another parish that was hijacked in the 19th century and become part of Lowestoft. If you go north of the town, there's the small parish of Gunton.
Mm-hmm.
I knew very little about historically until I was invited to give a talk a couple of years ago about the history of it, and I had a few months to prepare and did some research, and I found it was a very, very interesting little parish, mainly because the manor of Gunton is in actual fact, the manor boundary is in actual fact, with a couple of exceptions, the parish boundary as well. So the history of the manor and the people who lived there and what they did is wrapped up with the history of the parish as well. And I've done a lot of research, and I found a lot of intrigue and facts I didn't know. So next week, all being well, the presentation I just need to tweak so that we can run it through this system and not through my laptop. The parish has a fascinating history, as I said. So what I'm calling it is aspects of Gunton's history. So it's not a complete history of the parish, but it's snapshots of different aspects of the parish of Gunton from the early 18th century through to almost the early 20th century, looking at different aspects, a lot of which revolves around the manor, Gunton Hall, and the Fowler family of Gunton, who were lords of the manor there, I think from 1810 until the last descendant died in about 1920. And the manor basically ceased to exist as an entity. So that's what I intend to do next week, is aspects of Gunton's history. And I'm sorry if it's not actually Lowestoft, but I do have another scheme if we're there here in a fortnight's time to cover Lowestoft. But I'll talk more about that a bit later, perhaps.
Okay, it sounds great. Sorry to put you on the spot all of a sudden.
No.
But in the meantime, quite a few comments have come in. We've got a little bit of delay popping up and creeping in to freeze people up a little bit. So we're going to work hard to try and resolve that. But in the meantime, just going to mention a few comments that have come in, and they've come just to let us know that people are still tuning in and enjoying it and widely anticipating part 2 of putting Kirkley back on the map.
That's right.
So those comments include from Jerry Poole.
Hi, Jerry.
Hi, Jerry. And from Maggie Clark. We've also got hello from the Drapers, Barry and Sue.
Hi.
Sorry, Barry and Jackie and Sue Day. I'm all of a dither tonight. So sorry, everyone. We've also got Martin Rivet. He says hello. We've got Jenny Moyes. Hi from the Museum of London. And now Jenny Moyes says, she corrects herself. Hi from West London. Now, what have we got? Jerry Paul says, sounds great. I imagine we're talking about aspects of Gunton at that point. And Chris Collins says, buffering seems to have gone better now. So hopefully we can continue and not have to not have to make any changes. But if we do, bear with us, and we'll try and keep it as seamless as possible. So when you're ready, Ivan, I'll begin with the slideshow.
Yeah, okay. If we just explain to people who perhaps haven't seen us do this before,
Sure.
we've got it, the slideshow a little bit slicker now, because instead of having to watch it on my laptop through my tablet, we've now, thanks to Stephen Paul, we've now been able to actually show the presentation direct onto your screen without an intermediary. So after last week, our first attempt, we were talking about it afterwards and saying how much better quality the presentation was. So we're going to continue down that line. The only thing is I have no control over the slideshow. A lot of the photographs are set automatically to change of their own accord, but many times the slide has to be changed manually, and either Stephen or Paul has to do that. So every so often I will have to say next please, or next one, so that they know that I'm ready to change slides. Okay, but having said that, if you I'll apologize now for those who weren't here last week. If you see me keep glancing over to my left, that's because the little tablet I'm watching this on is quite wee, and it's a metre and a half away from me, and I have a job seeing the screen sometimes in the detail. So I'm running the slideshow in parallel, the same one on my laptop, which is just here to my left. So every so often, to see the detail, I will need to look away from the main screen and look at my laptop. It's either that or I have to push my nose right up against the screen to see it, and I'm sure nobody wants me to do that. So I'm ready to rock and roll when you are. So if you go 3, 2, 1 and go. 3, 2, 1. So here we go then. This is looking back at Kirkley, entitled Putting Kirkley Back on the Map, and this is part 2. And I'm going to pick up from where I left off a week ago. Just not quite exactly the same. What I intend to do, I intend to actually just go back retrospectively 2 or 3 slides prior to where I finished last week, so that you get some idea of where we're coming from, in case you've forgotten from last week. So this is a map, an original map dated 1832, showing in the centre of the screen Kirkley Church, and you'll notice as well they use the alternative spelling of Kirkley here. They call it Kirkley. For some reason down the years, it seemed to either be spelt with a K in the middle or a T in the middle. So it's Kirkley Street. To the left of that, you've got Patefield Street, the northern side of which historically has always been in Kirkley. Going to the left, bottom left-hand corner, this is the new harbour that was completed in 1830 and officially opened in 1832. Prior to that, there was no cut through there at all. That's an artificial cut that was made in 1830. The cut was made, 29 if you want to be accurate. The long straight road that you see, that dates from 1785. That's the London Turnpike Road, stretched from the bottom of Lowestoft High Street all the way through to the top of Patefield Road, and then went down Patefield Road onto Patefield Street. Prior, at the time the road was built, most of Kirkley that you can see immediately to the south, to all left of Lake Lothing, was all common land. That common land was enclosed in the Act of Parliament was 1801. The land was actually physically enclosed, divided up into fields, and in some cases building plots, in 1803. up until 1803, there were, apart from the windmill, there was very, very few properties. Well, in fact, there were no properties along that road. And you can see here the little road that you can see within the red circle ellipse that I put on there. Those are the embryonic first buildings to go up in Kirkley, probably dating from the early 1820s. The area between them and the sea, before the land, the common land was enclosed, was all common land, so anybody could cross the common and go down onto the beach at Kirkley to get to the seaside. When the land was enclosed and became private property, the people of Kirkley still had a right to go down to the seashore, and so a road, and you can see that on the left-hand side of the ellipse, if you look at it, a road was made so that people could still get down to the seaside. That's now, to put it into modern context, that's now Claremont Road. And within that ellipse, as I said, are the very, very first buildings to go up in Kirkley. And if we could just change slides now, and those buildings we can still see in Kirkley today. So there's the first ones. Now, again, this is where I basically got to and finished off last time. You have to imagine these buildings not part of extensive buildings the whole length of the road. These are basically quite nice quality houses. They weren't built as shops. These are nice quality houses, basically sitting overlooking the sea to the front. There's no buildings when they went up between them and the sea, and behind them would be open farmland, and there would be empty land to the. If you can imagine some of the smaller Suffolk villages that even today you can drive through, which are just a smattering of houses along the side of the road, that's the picture you need of Kirkley in the 1820s and 30s. And also these buildings, as you can see here, they all have a single story shop. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 nice quality 3-story houses, and the shops are a much later edition. The shops were actually built out over small enclosed front gardens. All of these houses would have had a nice front garden. The shops are a much later addition when the town began to prosper, became a wealthy port and harbour, and a great influx of people, of which I'll talk about towards the end of this evening. Then there was more and more demand for shops, and the enterprise and people of Kirkley who lived in these 4 houses actually had single-story shops built out over their gardens and used the ground floor at the back as part of the shop as well. So again, you've got to use a little bit of imagination to see these buildings as they eventually originally went up. If we move to the next slide, some of the other very early buildings, these are now, again, you can identify some of these as being the original buildings, little blocks of smaller cottages facing out onto the turnpike. The secret of looking at buildings when you walk around the town is actually to look up, look at the roofs and look at the roof lines. And you can see in many cases on this side of the road, this wasn't a continuous row of buildings and houses in the 1820s and 30s. These were pairs, if not 3 cottages in a row with a gap before you came to the next one. And down the years, down the generations, these gaps have been filled in, infill with other shops and houses. But there again, the evidence is that these are some of the earliest buildings to go up. Certainly 1 or 2 of these would have been here in the 1830s. And we move on to the next slide. We're going to go further south on the west side of London Road South. Again, you can see here a very similar situation as the one we were just looking at, with the three-storey houses with their gardens in front, and the same applies here. Knock down the buildings each side of these cottages, knock the shops down, put little gardens there, walk into the house, go out into the back garden, and you're looking out over the fields back in the 1820s and 30s. And again, the same thing applies here. By the well into the second half of the 19th century, shops were built, single-story shops were built out over the gardens. The enterprising person in the left-hand one actually put a first floor over top of his shop or her shop as well. So that's, again, you've got to see these as sitting quite independently of any other buildings, because at that time there were very few buildings nearby. And if we go up the road, or down the road if you like, southwards a little bit further, and we change slides. Fortunately here, and let's hope it never changes, we can actually see another pair of cottages, one of which again has had a shop built out over the front garden, but next door to that the front garden is still intact and extant. And so you've got to imagine all of those properties that I've just shown you, the four bigger ones further down, and then the three we just looked at, and this pair, you've got to see them as sitting in glorious isolation overlooking the road with their little enclosed gardens, or some people would call them yards, at the back. And the rare access to these properties was it through the black gate on the left hand side. So these are, as I said, hopefully one day, if I could see the deeds to some of these properties, I could put a firm date on them. But I'm quite certain they date from the mid 1820s, if not a little bit earlier. And of course, when you have any community starts getting this self-established, the two things back in the day what were needed was, one was a church. Well, Kirklees got its church. It's been there for hundreds of years, and we'll come on to that in a moment. Because the other thing that you need is a public house. And if we change slides again, here's the Plough and Sale in Kirkley, and certainly that public house was there in 1851, and there appears to be a pub on this site, possibly 10 years prior to that as well. William Bunn was the beer house keeper, and even back in 1851, that pub was known as the Plough and Sale. The information comes from the 1851 census return for, and it would be quite a busy little pub, although there's not many houses, because remember the road in the front there, built in 1785, is now the main road through part of the London Turnpike. So there would be carriages, coaches, and people travelling to Lowestoft or from Lowestoft along this road. If you had a long journey and you've had to come all the way from Pakefield before you find another pub, here's a good watering hole to stop at before you get into Lowestoft. So there's a purpose behind this pub. And I think the certainly by the 1840s and 50s, Lowestoft, and to a certain extent from the beach, Kirkley and Pakefield were becoming busier as fishing ports. But of course, when this place was built, it was basically looking out over the fields to the west. So you've got the sails at the back as you look out over the sea, and when you look out at the front over the fields, there's the men ploughing the field. So you've got the plough and the sail, and I think that's possibly, I can't prove it, but that's probably where the name of the pub comes from. Unlike Lowestoft, north of the bridge in Lowestoft proper, and not Kirkley, it expanded very, very rapidly, and the projects to expand the town north of Lake Lothing were a bit more grandiose than Pakefield. And much of Pakefield initially, sorry, Kirkley, not Pakefield, much of Kirkley initially was kind of developed piecemeal, unlike in Lowestoft itself, where many of the back streets, Bevan Street, Tolling Street, and some of the earlier streets there, they actually went up almost as complete entities as long terraces. It didn't really happen in Kirkley, and when it did happen, it was a bit random. So if we change slides again and cross the road and go behind the buildings overlooking London Road South, the London Turnpike, there's this strange little, two strange little terraces here. Again, they seem to have gone up pretty peacefully. These are at right angles to the road. These ones on here, Union Place, they face north. And if you look carefully, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4 slightly bigger cottages, and then there's some more cottages beyond them that are probably later additions. And on the other side, I couldn't get a good photograph of those. Orchard Terrace, slightly better quality houses than those. And these are kind of just now hidden behind the buildings on London Road South. So these are possibly embryonic back streets that never came to anything. We'll look at the development of Kirkley in a little bit more detail in a moment. So I'm going to push on because I've got a fair number of slides here to go. So if we change slides again. So we now come to probably the jewel in Lowestoft, or Kirkley's crown, if you like, the Wellington Terrace here, completed in 1858. There's another view of it a little bit later. A beautiful, I love this photograph, it's one of my favourites. You remember me saying last time that the statue of Triton, one at each end of the original esplanade, the brainchild of Samuel Morpito, built by the Lucas brothers, this marked the southern extremity of the original 450-yard long promenade. As you can see, I hope, the cobbled wall on the right centre, that's the wall that separates Parade Road South. That's the road that you had to go down to get onto the original promenade. And if you look, follow the line of that wall eastwards to the left, you can actually see a very straight line, distinctive straight line. That is in actual fact the end of P2's sea wall. Now, the sea wall had to be extended in the 1860s because it was just flat open beach with the houses with their gardens in front of them that would become Wellington Gardens, nothing between them and the sea. And every time there was an extra high tide, the basements of Wellington Terrace would often flood. And so in the end, they had to, they decided the best way around that was to extend the promenade all the way to Claremont Road to serve as a protection for those properties on Wellington Terrace. And Wellington Terrace, in actual fact, were built as very, very high class lodging houses for the great and the good, who would now be coming to Lowestoft by train. Had been doing that since 1847, and Lowestoft's morphing it, for want of a better word, into the seaside town. If you look right at the very back, in the background, you can see open fields. That's the higher land, the southern part of Kirkley. That of course leads you out to Kirkley Cliff, and there's no property, there's nothing there whatsoever, just still open fields. And this is all stuff that's ripe for development. Now, if we change to the next slide, hopefully, here's another view a little bit later. And if you look to the extreme right of Wellington Terrace, you can see there's no property standing in there at all. Those date from a bit later. These are from the 1870s, and this is Victoria Terrace. Now, you mustn't think we've now got what we call the middle drive in Lowestoft. That wasn't built as a continuous road. If you imagine yourself standing down on the Royal Plain and you start walking past Marine Terrace, those lovely terrace of 50 houses that takes you up to Parade Road South. When you got to Parade Road South, you couldn't get any further because the buildings actually stretched right across the road. And so Victoria Terrace, and if you look on the right-hand side of this map on the road level, you can actually see that you can't get out of that road. And the roads in front of Wellington Esplanade and later Kirkley Cliff, when they were first laid out, they were private roads to enable the owners of the lodges in the properties to get to their properties. They were not public highways as such. They had no drainage. They were just access roads. And it wasn't until really the 1860s, 70s and 80s that they finally joined up all of these short lengths of road, private roads, and they became public highways, properly drained and metalled there. And of course, Middle Drive, the name is interesting. Why Middle Drive? The middle of what? Well, London Road South, the turnpike, is, you like, the West Drive, and at this time you could actually take horses and carts and carriages up the Esplanade. So that's the East Drive, and when they created this one up the middle, it became known locally as the Middle Drive. It was between the Esplanade and the London Turnpike. So that's why we get Middle Drive. But back at this time, it's not a drive, it's not a public road whatsoever. You've got to see these developments, each one at first, not part of something joined up plan, but as large piecemeal developments. So if we go on to the next slide. Now, this is based on other map evidence. This is the map of Kirkley from 1878. I've superimposed it over top of an earlier map, so you can see, as I hope, the two, one faded through. The 1878 map shows how much development there was. I'll explain these buildings to you in a moment. You can see now, right at the top of the map, extensive building work has gone on. There are more streets. Windsor Road, Cleveland Road are being laid out. Some of the other back streets are being laid out. There's development along Carlton Road, where the arrow is pointing. And if you come down the map to Pakefield Street, there's a tremendous amount of development, laying out of new roads between Pakefield Road, London Road South, and Pakefield Street. That triangular of land is being filled in very, very rapidly. Once you lay out the roads, then the houses come. But there is still a lot of farmland there in 1878. Sorry, excuse me. That arrow points to the first school that was erected in Kirkley, and this is the school you can see in the top picture on the right. I tentatively dated it again without evidence, going back to the original deeds of the building. It seems to have gone up approximately 1876, and the architect of that, a man we'll meet 2 or 3 times in this talk, as we did last week, was John Louth Clements, the architect, one of the leading architects in 19th century Lowestoft. And I'm pretty certain that's him you can see standing in front of the school in the top picture. If you look at the top picture, you can see behind that the crenellations and tar of what appears to be a castle. It's not Kirkley Castle at all. The bottom picture is an earlier view before the school was taken. Running immediately in front of the castle-like building is Carlton Road. So we're standing somewhere where Southwell Road is, looking up across the field, and you can see Kirkley St Peter Church in the background. That building is in fact Kirkley's water tower. When more and more houses were built, the waterworks at Lowestoft couldn't cope with supplying the extra water. So they discovered a great underground spring here, and the water was pumped to the top of this tower and then piped out to the houses that were being built. And by the time this photograph was taken, which I think has been dated to about 1872, the water tower had actually was obsolete. It's now the houses at the bottom of St Peter's Road. As you go up to St Peter's Church today, they stand on the site of the old Kirkley water tower. So if we just change slides again, please. And of course, Kirkley's first school still exists. It's now the church hall and still very much in use today as a community hall. There's a preschool there, and it's used quite a lot by different community groups. I've given one or two of my history talks there as well. So that's the very first school to be built in Kirkley. And we move on again, if we change slides, please. So now we come to Kirkley St Peter's Church. There's different aspects here I want to bring. Let's talk about the church itself. I've actually made some notes here because I've reached an age where I can't hold dates in my head. You see the two red arrows. Let's give, before I just go on to talk about the church itself and that road that runs the bottom right past the church. It's built almost certainly on the highest point of Kirkley. And here we are, we're looking northwest to the church, basically through where the main gate is today. If you look, I hope you can see it sharp enough on the screen, but if you look in the far distance to the left of the church, where the red arrow is pointing, you can see a windmill. That's the windmill stood in Alton, to present day Alton Broad on Bridge Road. That's the windmill there. And again, very faintly, but you can make out to the right of the church where the other arrow is pointing, that is actually St Margaret's Church across Lake Lothing on the highest point in Lowestoft. So you can see Kirkley Church was built in a very prominent place. And again, on the extreme right, below that arrow and below St Margaret's Church, you can actually see the roads of the farm that stood on what's now Kirkley Street. And the farmhouse, which dates from the 18th century, is still standing there at the end of a little terrace of cottages. In actual fact, they're called, I think it's called Ivan Cottages. I used to go that way to school when I went to what was then the Alderman Woodrow Secondary Modern Boys School, otherwise known as Notley Road School. I often used to walk there and wondered why those cottages had my name over the top of them. Anyway, that's an aside. This sketch dates from 1819, and if you look at the front now, again, if you have seen the first half of this talk, before London Road, the London Turnpike was laid out in 1785. To get to Pakefield, you had to go come up the now disappeared road that was much further to the east than the turnpike, and you had to turn into Carlton Road, and then you had to get down roughly where St. Peter's Road now is, and then come up the hill past the church, and that was the main road. And you can see that track, or that road, down at the bottom right of the picture. And that's the old main road through to Pakefield. It took you out eventually to the top of Pakefield Road, down Pakefield Road and Pakefield Street. The church itself is not an ancient church. By the middle of the 17th century, the church of St. Peter at Kirkley was in a very ruinous state, and it couldn't be used for worship anymore. And so the people of Kirkley, most of them who lived in Pakefield Street anyway, had to use Pakefield Church. And the rector of Kirkley had an agreement with the rector of Pakefield that they would take turns conducting services for their respective churches, one for Kirkley. And you've got the two medieties, the two halves of Pakefield Church, even today. And so that was fine until, again, just check my dates. By 1878, 1748, let's get my dates right. 1748, the rector of Pakefield fell out with the rector of Kirkley, and the rector of Pakefield said, "You can't use my church anymore, rector of Kirkley, get one of your own." And the wonderful vicar of Lowestoft, the Reverend John Tanner, set up a fund to have Kirkley St. Peter Church repaired and put back into use. And if you look at the parish registers of Kirkley St. Peter, the original ones, or even the transcripts that are held in the Lowestoft Record Office when it eventually opens, you can see all the details of how much money was raised and spent, and who made contributions to the rebuilding of that church. And it opened in 1749, the year after the fund was started. And it's thanks to the rector of Lowestoft, John Tanner, who did a lot in Lowestoft and for the district. So that's so this church that you see here, if you note, the tower is not symmetrical with the nave of the church. That's because basically the original medieval church was demolished, and this one, the nave and porch of the 1748-49 church, was built off centre. The church tower is not joined actually to the church as it is in most churches. Now, if we go on to the next slide, this is 1850. So this is a view, another view of the rebuilt church. By 1850, once again, the church was becoming somewhat ruinous, and eventually it became so dilapidated that it had to be basically rebuilt again. Again, this is looking northwest, and you can see that the couple standing there. They're standing on the old high road from Lowestoft to Pakefield, and again on the extreme right you can see the rows of the buildings of the farm on Kirkley Street, and way in the distance beyond them you can see St. Margaret's Church in Lowestoft standing tall and proud on the highest point in the parish of Lowestoft. And it's a very bucolic scene even in 1850. And as you can imagine, if you think about it, if you could climb into this picture and you could take a stroll northwards, you would then come to the Esplanade and the South Pier of Lowestoft and the harbour. But this area here is still very, very rural and bucolic. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is the rebuilt church. This was rebuilt in 1875. Basically, it was the original church funded by John Tanner was so dilapidated that the church was rebuilt. It was made much larger simply because the population by 1875 had really grown. And the architect who designed the church was our friend John Lowestoft Clements. As I said, one of the principal architects who had been brought to Lowestoft in the 1840s by Samuel Morton Peto to design Wellington Terrace and many of the other buildings that you see. And once again, if you look in, not right in the foreground, but this side of the hedge gate, you can see still the track that was the old high road to Pakefield. And another very far-sighted architect improved the church yet again in 1895. So the church that you see today is the work of Thomas Porter, another architect, who he didn't knock Clements Church down. What he did was he improved it, and if we can just change slides again, this church that you can see here, this is looking northeast from the corner of the churchyard. The church itself is basically John Lowestoft Clements' work. The tower is probably a late medieval tower, but what's very, very unique about this church is the apsidal, the curved baptistry that has been built by Porter in the corner. Very, very rare in Church of England churches. In fact, I read somewhere there's only 3 churches in this country, Church of England churches, that have this type of semicircular baptistry. And it's very common in Roman Catholic churches, but very rare in Anglo-Catholic churches. If you've never been to Kirkley and visited the church, it's an interesting building. And here you can see quite clearly that the late medieval church tower is not in any way joined to the body of the church. So that's St. Peter's Church. And of course, St. John's Church that was mentioned, we'll see it again in a moment. St. John's Church that was built and opened in 1852, much further south. After it was demolished, I think it was in the 1970s off the top of my head, the dedication was transferred. So this is now St. Peter's and St. John's and not just St. Peter's Church. So we push on. We've still got lots of ground to cover. Change slides. The problem with Kirkley was there was just too many people living in Kirkley and nowhere to bury them in Kirkley. The churchyard of St. Peter's Church is minuscule. There's and so in 1875-76, a municipal cemetery was built and laid out and built in Kirkley, down the London Turnpike, London Road South. And again, the designer and architect of that was John Lowestoft Clements. And you can kind of see the religious divide with the 2 chapels. The chapel nearest the camera here was built for Anglicans to hold their burial services in. The other chapel that you can see to the north, that was actually built for non-conformists to hold their burial services in. And the architecture of this is so John Lowestoft Clements. You can see the stuff that he built, or the stuff that he designed. Once you get used to his style, you can point to buildings and say, I bet you John Lowestoft Clements designed that. Perhaps I can give a talk about him one day if these continue. So let's push on and change slides. Okay, so we're back in Kirkley in 1878. Now, it's interesting how bits of the very early parish linger on. This is Lawson Road, and you can see all the other roads actually run more or less at right angles to each other off London Road South, apart from Lawson Road. And Lawson Road runs at an angle. The reason for that is until 1803, that's the boundary between a large field, the angle, the boundary between the large field and what was the common land. And so when they enclosed the common land, they kept that field boundary. And so the field belongs to one person, and the land that was allocated from the common land belonged to somebody else. And when this terrace was built, it was actually built along the field boundary. And that's why Lawson Road runs at a strange angle to the rest of the buildings there. Carlton Road by the 1878 is beginning to be expanded, and these rather nice townhouses are built there. That's on the corner as you go round to the bottom of Kirkley Park Road and Kirkley Street. These are for the middling, the artisans, if you like, but south of the parish, on Patefield Road in particular, this is where the more wealthy people are having their houses built by this time, overlooking on the top of the cliff, overlooking the sea. And as we'll see later, many of them would actually come to regret that. So the town is growing, and of course, what we haven't mentioned, we've now got the East Suffolk Railway, 1859. That was built to Beccles, and later where you joined up to go to London. Again, I'm not going into the history of that particular branch line. It became a goods line, but it was originally meant to be for passengers. And down close to Belvedere Road, there was going to be another Lowestoft railway station built. So there was going to be a railway station each side of Lake Lothing. But then they realised that it would be cheaper just to put a bridge across the western end of Lake Lothing and link up with the line to Norwich, and use the Lowestoft Central Station as the main railway station. And so the Kirkley station never got built. And as the industry developed along the south shore of Lake Lothing, then it became a goods line. So that's just how the town is expanding at this period. So we move on to the next slide. And there's some of the grandiose houses that have gone up this time. This is Clarendon. It sits at the top end of Morton Road, opposite the old Congregational Church, between Patefield Road and Wilson Road. A wonderful old house. It's now opposite the old Congregational Church, I said, which I think is now St Nicholas Roman Catholic Church. It's completely gone, and there's a small private housing estate on the site. I was born in Wilson Road, and that stood semi-derelict in the 1950s and 60s when I grew up there, until the land and the house was bought up by a building contractor. He demolished the house and laid out the houses that you see there today. So that's another one of the fancy houses that were going up. So if we move on to the next slide. Again, we're still in 1878. So as I said, the north of the parish now, the north of Kirkley, is becoming industrialised because of the harbour. This is the large factory belonging to the Lucas brothers, basically working in timber. That's I marked that with the area, with the arrow. And here, as I mentioned earlier, along the cliff edge to the north of Patefield Street and to the east of Patefield Road, these very big houses are being built, and literally only a few yards away from the cliff edge. So that's the difference, how Kirkley is evolving now. We've got industry and tourism to the north. We've got the shops, houses being built further to the south, and then right to the far south of the parish, we've got all of the back streets that are beginning to be laid out, extending northwards from Patefield Street. Then we've got the big houses for the great and the good on Patefield Road to the east. So we push on to the next slide. Now, if you look to the left, you should hopefully see a red line appear in a moment. That is the track of one of the forgotten field paths of Kirkley. If this is working, yes, here it goes. These paths are ancient, very old, down to the Blackheath, and then eventually down to what becomes Stradbroke Road. This is now Blackheath Road, or part of it is Blackheath Road. If you climb into the picture, I'm sure some of you who are Kirkleyites are aware, and you walk down there, you come to Blackheath Woods. And the path is the path on the left-hand side of the photograph, and you can still follow that path all the way through until you get down to Love Lane, which brings you out onto Stradbroke Road. That's one of the very ancient remains of one of the ancient field paths. The other ancient field path is the one that's just appeared. Again, it leads from what's Blackheath Road down to London Road South, not far from Short Street, and that's the bottom end of it. And here is the eastern end, and this path will take you all the way through the behind the cemetery and the allotment gardens, and you can get all the way through. Again, this is a very ancient field path, and there is evidence from earlier maps that it actually continued and took you all the way down to the coast at Patefield, well, to Patefield Street anyway. And the All Saints Road in Patefield is probably preserves the right of way of this old footpath. Now, I used to cycle up there quite often on my way to school, and everybody knew it round there as the oily fields. And I often used to be on my boat wondering, why oily? What's oily about them? And then it was many, many, many years later, when I was researching the history of Kirkley, I suddenly found a map where this area where the oily fields crosses was actually known as the High Lee. So oily was a wonderful Suffolk way of pronouncing High Lee. So these fields round that the path crossed were known as the High Lee Fields, but by the time I grew up there in the 1950s and 60s, we called them the oily fields. So that's the oily fields, or the High Lee Fields. So that's the second highest piece of ground from St. Peter's Church. St. Peter's Church is a little bit higher, and it's interesting that Kirkley, the name originates from probably the old Scandinavian kirk and the word ley, meaning a clearing. So you've got the church in the clearing, the Kirkley, and here you've got the other high piece of ground, which is known as the High Lee, or the other clearing. If you're clearing land way back when to plant crops and that, you want to go to the highest and driest land. And so this is possibly where some of the earliest fields were in Kirkley. So we push on to the next slide. We've got another forgotten footpath, I hope. Again, if you look towards the top of the map, if my red line is going to do its bit for us, you'll see a red line coming down from Horn Hill and running all the way down to the northwestern end of Kirkley Street. That again, we know was there quite a long way. It's now been incorporated into the new road that takes you down to the footpath and takes you down to the car park. I think that's called Kirkley Rise, and it goes down as far as Salisbury Road. It's extinguished after then, but the again, that just preserves its a fossilized ancient trackway. Unfortunately, most of it has been extinguished now. So that's another one of the two definite ancient footpaths that we know existed in Lowestoft, and to a certain extent still exists today. So push on to the next slide, and as we do so, I shall have a drink of water. So we're coming back now to the 1860s again. The next big terrace to be built was, it was finished by 1868. This is going up from Wellington Terrace. This is Kirkley Cliff Terrace. Kirkley Cliff Terrace, not quite so grand as Wellington Terrace. Again, overlooking, when it was built, an open field. And the road in front of that, again, is a private right-of-way for these houses, and it's some years before that private road becomes a public highway. I don't know if this slide has got to change automatically or not, but I'm not going to wait to see. So if we flick to the next, what we're going to do now is go out onto Kirkley Cliff into the 1880s to see what it was like then. Yes, we are going to go out. So this is round about the same time. You can see Kirkley Cliff on the extreme left in the foreground. There's no upper esplanade on Kirkley Cliff. Kirkley Cliff is still almost a natural cliff. And we're looking north now to Wellington Gardens, and in the far distance you can see the harbour at Lowestoft. And this would change. So now we've moved even further south from where the last photograph was taken. Kirkley Cliff Terrace on the left. The bathing machines on the beach. No Claremont Pier. We haven't built Claremont Pier yet. And then we'll move even further, turn around and walk further south, hopefully, if this machine is doing its job. There we are. Now we're getting up towards the Grand Hotel. You can see just centre right in the distance. Again, this is totally undeveloped. It's just basically field paths. There is a building you can see on the right. I can't identify it, but I think that's what would become the St Mary's Convent, a building called Stronsay, more of which in a little while. There's no lower esplanade here, but by the late 1860s, early 1870s, a concrete path was laid along the foot of the cliff, all the way from the esplanade in Lowestoft, all the way down to Pakefield, so that the ladies and gents could walk along there without having to get sand in their shoes. And you can see that running from the almost bottom left of the picture below the cliff into the middle distance, and then going up the cliff at Pakefield. So that's an embryonic, it's not built as a seawall, it's not even built as an esplanade, it's just a couple of yards wide concrete strip raised from the beach so that people don't have to get sand in their shoes. This picture looks as it was, I think the date is either 1890 or 1898. So we push on to the next slide. And I come back into Lowestoft, a couple of pictures just to see how the development is going on. Here we're looking south towards St John's Church, the unmetalled roads, and we're looking towards Pier Terrace, except Pier Terrace hasn't been built yet when this photograph was taken. There's the fairly recently built St John's Church. There's all the lads in the photograph. And if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of the photograph, in the unmade roads, the roads are just dusty tracks. There's no real pavement. Nothing is paved. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner, there's something lying in the road, and you can see a little lad standing there with his shovel. So I would imagine there's been a horse and cart, or horses go past there, and he's now going to take that home for his dad to put on the rhubarb. So, and some of the nice big high quality houses that were built in London Road South. And we move further up London Road South. Again, I'm sorry about the quality, it's a poor quality picture, but you can see once again, although there are footpaths by this time, this is a slightly later photograph than the last one, the roads are still unmetalled. They're still basically dusty tracks in summer and muddy tracks in the winter. But this area in London Road South, immediately up from Belvedere Road, this is where the doctors and the solicitors and the artisans are living in their nice big houses. Most of those have gone. Now there's garages and workshops, as I'm sure you know, because the wall on the left is the wall, a lot of which is still there today, the back of Marine Terrace. And so we push on to the next slide. And I mentioned the railway line that the goods line that ran from the East Suffolk Railway line, laid out in the late 1850s. And here's a view with Cleveland's Mill, hence Cleveland Road. You can see the bridge over Mill Road on the right. The mill, this tower mill was built in about 1829 and predated and postdates an earlier one. And of course, the railway track has long since gone, but the bridge at Mill Road is still there, and the railway track has now become a footpath. We need just to change, sorry, we need to change the slide. Sorry about that, yeah. I changed mine and I forgot to ask Paul to change his. Sorry about that. Yeah, this is Cleveland's Mill, dated from about 1829. And as I said, it's, I'm just switching my side. There we go. You can see the bridge from carrying Mill Road over the railway track. This is the extension of the railway from Beccles. It parts company from the line from Lowestoft to Beccles out Broad South Station. And of course, the line still is fossilized, if you like, is a public footpath today. And you can still walk part of that railway line, or most of that railway line actually, to take you down to Tom Crisp Way under the footbridge and brings you out on Belvedere Road. So again, a big change, but fortunately we haven't built over that bit, and there's still somewhere we can walk. So this time, yes, we do need to change slides. Thanks, Paul. Okay. I think something's meant to happen here in a moment. Yeah. By the 1880s, 1878, 1880, 1885, the land is being sold off for extensive development and different estates are being laid out. So to the south of the parish, you've got the Acton estate, named from the lady Elizabeth Acton, who actually owned the estate, the fields. We get Acton Road, leading you from London Road South to Walmer Road. Then in the middle, there's the Kirkley Park estate. The name lives on in Kirkley Park Road. Again, that's being laid out for quality housing. You've got the Kirkley Cliff estate. This is the area between modern day Kensington Road and Clermont Road. and then you've got the Lawn Park estate. Lawn Park Road lives on that name, and then right at the top, in the very boggy land that was the Kirkley Ham, although that's shrunk inside by this day, there's the West Lowestoft estate. So the land is now very, very rapidly being divided up and basically for building, as the town is rapidly expanding, thanks to the fishing industry, thanks to the railway, thanks to the imports and exports coming into Lowestoft, and obviously the tourist trade as well. So Lowestoft is expanding. The problem is, when we reach this point, it's just me trying to pick out points. Obviously, I can't cover every change that took place or have photographs to cover them. So I'm just going to go, not randomly, but go through some of the changes, the later changes in Kirkley and why they occurred. So we change slides again. Yeah, can you change to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, here's a lovely view looking north, and the building, which should be marked with an arrow any moment, if this thing is working. Yeah, that's South Lord Preparatory School, dating from the building itself dates from the 1870s. This is a wonderful view looking so. And South Lord Prep School was one of the schools for wealthy middle-class children. When you look at the census, you can see they're coming from all over the country there. And you can also see as well, Middle Drive, so-called, is now becoming a public highway. So this is South Lodge Preparatory School. I found a prospectus for it. You can see again the way the esplanade is slowly expanding on the right side, or lengthening and coming this way. And you can see, I think this is a wonderful view to give you some idea of how this photograph is probably taken about 1880. And if you think that 80 years before that, this was completely open common land. With sand dunes leading down to the sea and marshes leading across to Lake Lothing. This is less than 100 years development in Kirkley. But there's the prospectus for boys between 7 and 14, preparing them for public schools and the Royal Navy for some reason. Average number of boys in the class is 8, etc., etc., etc. And it existed for quite a long time. It was, I think, it was damaged when the German fleet bombarded Lowestoft in 1916, and again had more damage in the Second World War and never opened. And here is a photograph of it taken from the junction with Claremont Road and Kirkley Cliff Road. And of course, one of its most renowned pupils was young Benjamin Britten, who lived just up the road on the other side, literally 5 minutes walk away. And this is where he had his early education. This is now the car park immediately to the north of Claremont Road. I don't know what the boys in the playground are doing, but they look as if they're practicing social distancing there at that time. And the sign that you can see, the road sign right in the center bottom of the picture, you can't see it too clearly, but it does actually say Kirkley Cliff. So these private roads now have not only been laid out and become public roads, but they've been given names. I'm going to push on to the next slide because I'm conscious of the time, so we can change slides. We can be coming even further up to date. One place that's totally forgotten because it only existed for about 5 years was St Albans College. The headmaster and owner of this private college was John Bruce Payne, and all of the buildings on Carlton Road, the South Lowestoft Salvation Army Hall, and all the buildings to the east of that were in actual fact all college buildings. And this was quite an upmarket school. And this lovely building, the Towers, again designed by John Lowestoft Clements, was taken over and rented by the owner and headmaster at the school, John Bruce Payne, and half of the building was used as accommodation and dormitories for the boys at the school, and the other half was where John Bruce Payne and his family lived. There were two playing fields. The senior boys' playing field was actually on the open field to the north of Rectory Road, and the junior playing field was much further down the other side of Carlton Road. When the college closed and the buildings and land was sold, the junior school playing field was built self-building development, and 3 streets were laid out there, and they were named for the head teacher and the owner. So we've got John Street, Bruce Street, and Payne Street. They're named in memory of this fella who apparently was very, very well respected, not just in Kirkley, but in Lowestoft. So that's where we get John Street, Bruce Street, and Payne Street from. We change slides again. So here's the junction of Carlton Road and College Road. College Road's going off to the left, and this is all part and parcel of the old college buildings up College Road and along and including the site, the present day South Lowestoft Salvation Army Hall. And apparently from a map that I've seen, this little building on the corner here, this little shop, was actually the college tuck shop. Again, these buildings were all designed by John Lowestoft Clements, our eminent architect. So we push on to the next slide. Because before the college even, in 1884, the Lovell Road schools were built, known as the Kirkley National School, and this is at the bottom of Lovell Road, and they were opened in 1884, during which period all over the country, great emphasis on the different education acts was placed on the education for youngsters. And so Lovell Road School, as it became known, it was actually built as Kirkley National School in 1884. Church Road School and other schools all over the town were erected at this time. So, as I say, Kirkley by now is moving into the 20th century, and we change slides again. So great was the population by the 1890s, early 1900s, that a mission church was built in Clifton Road, St Matthew's Church. This was to serve the people living away from St John's Church, and it was a wonderful church, and it's now all completely gone. It was only demolished a few years back, and I think this is now where the Kirkley medical practice and what have you all built. There was quite a controversy when it came down, and so this is the interior of St Matthew's Church, which came and went in approximately 100 years. We move on to the next one. Churches quite abounded in those days. They weren't all big buildings. Here's a tiny little nonconformist chapel in the back streets of Kirkley. I haven't been able to find out exactly which of the nonconformist churches or chapels really met in here, but this is now a builder's store, but it's one of the other small churches. On the corner of Lawson Road, built in 1904 with this wonderful South Lowestoft Methodist Church. Not the most exquisite building. It remained there until the 1960s when it was demolished, and the Methodist Church on the corner of Carlton Road and London Road South was erected. But this is another one of the churches and buildings that have come and gone in South Lowestoft. I'm moving rapidly on because I'm aware time is running out. And of course, on the Kirkley Cliff estate, the building estate, some of the largest plots were taken up and built with these wonderful big mansions with sea views. I'm just getting the date of those for you. Yeah, 1897 they opened, and there's 3 blocks of them, as you can see from this later photograph, Victoria Mansions, and at the same time the Victoria Hotel was built. It was built at the same time in the same style as a private hotel, and it's remained since 1897 as a hotel. It's never been a private house that's been converted into a hotel, or a hotel that's been partly converted into a private house. It's always been a hotel. And of course, by the 1930s, below the cliff here, you've got the Victoria bathing station and chalets. So the great and the good are really moving in by the late 1800s, early 1900s to the big houses on the cliff edge at Kirkley. This is the same place where the photographs were taken only a few years earlier that we saw, just those rough cliff top walks. Within a very short time, they're all developing. These big houses are being built along the cliff top. This is further up from the Victoria Mansions. It's gone now, and there's a really horrible modern building in its place, built as a big private house. It was taken over. I rather like this. There's a bit of early photoshopping here. It was taken over by a lady who owned a small guest house on London Road South called Dagmar Guest House, and she expanded her business, and she bought this and turned it into a bigger guest house. And she's got the person who took the photograph of the glass negative to actually scratch Dagmar Guest House across the front of it. The writing's not actually on the building, apparently. The writing's been scratched onto the glass plate negative. By the middle of the 1920s, the Dagmar Guest House was sold, and it was bought by the nuns of St. Nania, who had St. Mary's Convent next door, and this became St. Mary's Convent Girls' School. So the buildings are always evolving. And we move on again. The biggest white elephant probably ever in Lowestoft. This is the Empire Hotel. It was opened on Empire Day, 28th of June, 1900. It was the plot, including the grounds, covered 3 acres. It was built by Spears and Pond Limited, and there's Mr. Spears and there's Mr. Pond up in the corner, and it was huge. The big tower that you can't quite see in the middle was a huge water tower. It cost £150,000 to build in 1898-99, and it had 293 rooms and could accommodate 250 guests in great luxury. It was said to be one of the biggest and best seaside hotels in the country when it was erected, but for some reason it just didn't work, and it couldn't pay for itself. And after the First World War, it closed and was taken over by London Metropolitan Council to become a hospital, St. Luke's Hospital, for people from London who were recovering from tuberculosis tuberculosis to convalesce. And the house you can see on the right hand towards the back there, that's Stronsay, that was built for a very wealthy retired London merchant, and he settled there with his family. And it eventually became St Mary's Convent, and that was, I'm trying to get the date for that, about 1920, small convent school that eventually, as I said, moved into that building that was Dagmar House. I'm moving on again because I'm conscious of the fact we're running out of time here. Here's Claremont Pier being built, early 1900s, and you can see the concrete path at the bottom of the cliff. It's been washed away. There's an extra high tide there. And if we go on to the next slide here, this is May the 30th, 1903, when the first steamer, the pier was built privately for the Bell Steamer Company to drop passengers off on their way from further south to Great Yarmouth. And here is the pier, the opening of the pier and the first steamer arriving, and it was very successful. Some people blame the pier on what happened later that year, and if we change slides now, please. Here's a photograph taken from the pier looking south. You can see Victoria mansions up on the right, and beyond them the Empire Hotel. A tremendous high tide and storm basically washed away the massive amount of the cliff and beach immediately to the south of Claremont Pier. And this is September 1903. This is the aftermath of that damage that was done by that storm. I think we should have another slide should merge into this one in a moment. If not, we'll change slides. So you can see a tremendous amount of damage is done, and a tremendous amount of the cliff has disappeared. And if we push on to the next slide, please. And November, there was another storm. Hang on, I think I've got a different slide to you up here. Let me have a look at your slide. Yeah, as you can see, there's a tremendous amount of damage there. The cliff has eroded, and I think if we could just move on to the next slide now, please. Again, November, there was another storm. They were then trying to repair the September damage, as you can see on the right-hand side, and another storm damaged the cliff. There's the prep school that Britain went to, the top left-hand corner of the picture, and a tremendous amount of damage was done. We move on to the next slide. Thank you. This was a big. This is the Grand Hotel. But just have a look at. Yeah, the Grand Hotel had once been a private house. Here we go. It was called Westmoreland House. That was converted into a hotel. The house dated probably from the 1870s. This was, and you can see after that great storm, after an earlier storm, 1901. Is it possible to take that slide back for me, Paul, please? Or Stephen? I'm not sure who's operating. Yeah, just one click and another click, and we should go back to it. Now, one click forward. One click forward. No, back. Can we go back? And again. no forward one. Bingo, there we are, that's where I am. And so you can see this is the big house that became the Grand Hotel, sitting at the top of the cliff. And there was a great storm here in 1901. Have a look at the thing, look at the cliff, look at the beach. On the extreme right, you can see the path leading to Lowestoft. After the storm of 1901, all of that cliff was completely washed away. The slide should change for you in a second. There we go. If you look on the top of the cliff to the right of the picture, that's the Grand Hotel. Everything has been washed away in 1901. And you see the other big houses that stood there along the cliff top in Kirkley, they're in danger of going away. And if we look, if you climbed up the cliff and you stood by the Grand Hotel at the the southern end of the Grand Hotel and looked south, you can see all of the houses under threat because of the amount of cliff that's gone. So this is Kirkley. We haven't come to Pakefield yet. And a tremendous amount of the cliff was lost here and at Pakefield in the next few years. These houses are all in the act of being demolished. And when the picture changes, that's the same view from that same spot today. There should be a colour slide come up for you any second. There we go. That's taken from exactly, I worked it out from a modern map compared with our map. That's the same view today. That's what's basically how much it's changed. And we're still in Kirkley. We're not in Pakefield yet. So we move on to the next slide, please. Kensington Gardens. The land here belonged to the Empire Hotel, and it was going to be this is the site of Kensington Gardens, looking from Kensington Road, the Kirkley Cliff on the right, on the left, and it was going to be a park in the early 1900s, but the First World War started, and the plans were shelved, and it wasn't until the 1920s. Again, I can give you an exact date for that because my brain is beginning to seize up. 1920s work commenced on building Kensington Gardens. Money was given by the government to employ many of the men who'd come back from the First World War with no work, and the whole of Kensington Gardens was laid out by the unemployed men of Lowestoft. And here's a view of the gardens being built. The gardens themselves were completed and opened on the 8th of June in 1922 with that wonderful bandstand where the big pond is today. As I said, they opened on the 8th of June in 1922. And they, thanks to the wonderful volunteers who look after them today, they are a real tribute to Kirkley. So as I said, I'm pushing on with this now because I'm conscious of the time is going. So we can change slides again. Because the South Beach in Lowestoft, once they repaired the cliffs, once they put in the more protection, here we are, we're coming into the 1920s now. You can see slowly the embryonic lower esplanade is being built. The sea is still a threat, obviously, because it comes right up to the sea wall. The people who lived there back then, if we could bring them to the present day and see how much the sea and the beach has been reclaimed there, they would be absolutely amazed. So that's the South Beach, just south of the Claremont Pier in the 1920s. If we go to the next slide, please. So Kensington Gardens didn't exist in a vacuum. They were part of a bigger scheme. And here we have the Kensington bathing station, which was built by unemployed men at the same time. The sloops up to the cliff to Kensington Gardens were meant to incorporate the gardens at the top of the cliff with the bathing station at the bottom of the cliff. Here's a photograph when it first was built, and now you can see by the 1930s the whole area was being paved in front of the bathing chalets. And sad to say, that whole lot now, despite it being, I think, a classic example of 1920s work, plus the fact it represents the effort that was put into this town to find work for the unemployed, all of that is about to be demolished, so I understand. And I find that quite sad, as I actually grew up only about 100 yards away from here and spent my boyhood there. But still, perhaps things have to change. And of course, the Grand Hotel itself is gone now. Possibly no great loss to the town, because it wasn't ever built as a hotel. It was just a large house that had bits and pieces added onto it to make it become a hotel. It wasn't particularly grand. So we move on to the next slide, and we're more or less to the end now. South Lowestoft Park, Kirkley Fen Park. Again, it was planned to have a park there in the 1890s, but for some reason they never got round to doing it. Here's a view of the park that they were going to build, Fen Park, and it wasn't until the 1920s that a local entrepreneur bought up the land and laid it out as a public park. And I can remember this game from the 1950s, and here we have a nice early view of Kirkley Fen Park. There were apparently you had to pay, I think, a penny to get into it because it was privately owned. There was a big cage of monkeys there that you could hire boats and picnics and what have you. And it was a really, really attractive park, as it still is once again, thanks to the volunteers who look after it. I'm pushing on rapidly to the next slide. I'm just coming to the end of there now, so I'm not going to say much about these. These are just to give an impressions that this is the junction of the Avenue, All Saints Road and London Road South, not long after the tramway was built, and we're looking north there. We move into Lowestoft. The next slide, please. And we're going down the London Turnpike. Here's the entrance to Carlton Road, and we can see this is about just over 100 years after the common land was enclosed. There would have been 100 years earlier, there would have just have been open fields all the way down here as you went down the road to the small one or two houses that were being erected on the side of the new road. And we moved south again, if we could change slides. And again, here you can see the old houses, the original houses on the left. They all now had their single-story extensions built over their front gardens. There's a great mishmash of different styles of architecture there. Nothing really, not much there is, again, another view. Nothing there is really part of an overall plan. I changed the sign at the bottom where it said London Road Lowestoft to London Road Kirkley, because it is Kirkley. We're moving on just right to the end of the talk now. I'm sorry it's gone on a bit long, and so if we could change slides once more, please. The Grand Cinema, Lowestoft's cinema. It was actually built in the early 1900s as a swimming pool, and there's the swimming pool. There's a grand bunch of men there, and eventually, say, it was converted into the cinema. And we move on to the next slide. The further south, the further north you get, down the turnpike, down London Road south, the bigger and grander the houses have become, the nearer you get to the town. These are much more designer houses, if you like. These are built for the wealthier people in the town. And this is the entrance to Windsor Road, if I'm not right. St John's Church in the background. If we could just change slides once more. The Olympian Gardens. Now, let's have a drink of water here. At the end of Marine Terrace, and we're on London Road South here, if you went down the road here, which I think is Parade Road south, onto Marine Terrace, there was an enclosed piece of land, not very big, only a few acres, and it's known as the Olympian Gardens, and it was in place for many, many years for the best entertainment in Kirkley. Illuminated at light, there was shows, plays, singing, bands there, and it was run by this group of people called the Olympian Entertainers, the Olympian Gardens. They were a fine bunch of Edwardian people there. It continued until the 1920s, when a 1,000-acre theatre, and that's what's there today, by the way. It continued until the mid-1920s, when a huge theatre was built on Claremont Pier, and then it kind of drifted away, and people were using the theatre on the pier. That theatre is gone as well, but it's now the site. A KFC is now on the site. I've just about finished now. I've overrun my time a little bit. I hope I haven't driven too many of you away. All I want to do for the last slide, and I think this is the last slide, there's been a census every year, every 10 years, from 1801 to the present day. We're supposed to have a census again next year. From there, I've been able to see how the population has changed. And here you can see the growth of the population in there, starting at 1801 at the bottom left. It goes up to 1901, and then after that, Kirkley is combined with Lowestoft, so I can't get figures of that. So you can see how the population of Lowestoft grew between Kirkley rather grew between 1801 and 1901. In 1801, the population is 177. Those who listened to the first half of this talk know it's been calculated from the Domesday Book of 1086 that the population of Kirkley was probably round about 150. So between 1086 and 1801, the population hasn't really grown at all. But between 1801 to 177, 100 years later, it's 6,465. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the last slide of the evening. Thank you. Sorry it's taken so long. There we go.
No need to apologise at all, Ivan. That was fascinating and a really good round off of the first part. I don't think anybody would mind at all just spending an extra 10-15 minutes hearing about it all. And if you don't mind, I'll read you some of the comments that have come in.
Okay.
First off, we have Chris Collins. He's just pipped in there. Ivan, that was a brilliantly illustrated talk. Thank you so much. Jerry Poole says, absolutely fabulous, as always. Karen Harris merely says, brilliant. And that's as succinct as we need. Thank you. Very informative, says Rosemary Bokert. Karen Harris, I've mentioned already. Jerry Poole, we don't mind at all. Keith Clark, again, a very interesting talk. I could go on, Ivan, but I'm just going to check. Everybody is very appreciative. Jenny Moy says, worked at the Fish Lab. And Val McCurdy says used to swim out to the diving board. Linda Boyd, such beautiful buildings, she says. Now, do you remember you mentioned there was a picture of the school and there were some schoolboys standing around in the field, and you said, I think they must be social distancing. Yeah, it looked like a game of cricket to me, but I could be wrong, because cricket in my book is just about keeping as far away from the ball as possible.
Funnily enough, I came to that same conclusion. There is, in actual fact, although you can't see anybody with a bat, right in the centre of the picture, there seems to be something sticking out of the ground, and the lad that's standing behind it is taken up what appears to be a wicket keeper's stance. When I was looking at that earlier today, and I came to the same conclusion. They're probably playing cricket there.
Yeah, good. Well,
I think the important thing is I'd like to stress is you take any. I was doing some research into St Albans College this afternoon, and there's enough material about the college, and apparently sent a lot of boys. Went from St Albans College straight to Cambridge. It was quite an important college, and it's totally forgotten in the town now, apart from College Road. And there's enough. I trawled enough information through local newspapers and elsewhere from them. You could almost put together a talk about St Albans College. You could give a complete history of St Peter's Church. The history of the convent is absolutely fascinating, especially the guy who built the private house that became the convent school. Wonderful, wonderful stories there. And it turns out that his son in the First World War went to Australia and was killed out there, but he served in the same battalion as I'm trying to think the fella's name now, the Australian from Lowestoft who got the Victoria Cross. Somebody out there can put the name up. It's totally gone. I think I'm going brain dead. But they served. Whether they ever met, I don't know. But there's two Lowestoft boys serving in France. One who'd lived in Lowestoft and gone to Australia a little bit earlier and got the VC posthumously, and then this other fella who'd only lived a few doors away from him had also gone to Australia later on, and they finish up in France, and they're both killed. I mean, there's just some wonderful, wonderful stories out there.
Yeah, let's hope they got the chance to have a chat and a couple. I'm just going to mention a couple more comments. Thank you. Very interesting. Came from Jackie Draper. Stephen says, "Is it Charles Castleton? Claude Charles Castleton? Is that the name you?"
Yeah, Claude Cut. Yeah, Claude Cut. That's the guy. Sorry, I should know. He's when I grew up in Wilson Road, he was actually born in obviously long before I was, but he was actually born in a house about 10 doors down from me in Wilson Road. And my parents told me that when they first moved in, his parents still lived in this house down the road. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Claude Castleton. Yeah, sorry, Claude.
Off the top of his head, we can assume that, and it wasn't Googled. Diana Carver says, "Thanks so much. So interesting, Diana. Lovely to know that you're out there. Thanks for joining us." Maggie Clark, thank you. And from Stephen Fennell, fascinating talk. Lived in Kirkley for over 30 years and yet learned so much over the two talks, not least the derivation of oily fields.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mary Williams, she says, "That was so interesting. I've learned so much about the area I grew up in." Thank you, Ivan. Well, it is a fascinating talk on a fascinating area of Kirkley. But if you're interested in the wider area in general, next week will be aspects of Gunton. So specific to Gunton and a very broad history, I think you said, of Gunton.
What it is the fact that how can I put this fairly succinctly? Gunton is a small parish. and not and most of the land was owned by the lord of the manor. There's very few people living there, so I've had to dig quite deep to find anything of interest. But what I did dig up, I could have focused just on, for instance, the Fowler family of Gunton, who built the new hall in 1810 when they bought the manor, and their descendants were still living there until the 1920s. It might even be the 1930s. I could have just focused on that family, but I discovered other aspects of the estate that I found fascinating, each one of which could develop into a much longer talk. So what I've done is I've called it aspects of Gunton, and so it's not a detailed history, but it's a look at different aspects of the history of Gunton and the few people that live there, and the farm, and the brick kilns, and the church, and the hall, the old hall, and the new hall, and a little bit of emphasis onto the different lords of the manor who have lived there as well. So it's not a complete history of Gunton whatsoever, but it is, I hope, going to give some idea of how even a small parish as Gunton could throw up some very, very interesting facts. So I'm going to hopefully have that all ready to run in a week's time. If we go on beyond that, and I have no reason to think that we won't, and I'm getting warm in here. If we go beyond, this is the only chance I get to wear a tie now. I don't go to work. I like my tie. Yeah. Beyond that, what I've suggested that we might do, everyone, that rather than go into sort of a lot of historic detail, I was thinking of doing, perhaps you could say whether you like the idea or not, just an old Lowestoft slideshow, an hour of pictures from late Victorian, early and the Edwardian period, showing how the town has changed. I do a presentation about the history of the scores in Lowestoft. I don't want to do anything as deep as that. I just really want to make an entertaining picture show, if you like, that you can sit back and have a look at the pictures with me explaining a little bit about each scene that you're seeing. And I thought of doing that. So rather than make it a history talk, just make it more. Do you remember my dear friend Jack Rose? I'm sure some of you do. He used to do these very similar slideshows. I thought of doing something a little bit along the lines of what Jack Rose used to do, the Monday after next. But anyway, we'll see what we do. But certainly, aspects of Bunn.
I think it's a fantastic idea. So does Jerry Poole. She says, "Oh yes, sounds great." Says Linda Boyce. Jackie Draper, yes please. Jenny Moyes, yes please. Chris Collins, great idea, yes please. Emma Kane, brilliant idea. I think it's a done deal, Ivan.
I think we've got the program for a fortnight's time.
Yeah. Before we lose some of our viewers, as we're rounding up to the end, I just want to mention your books that are on sale at Waterstones for anybody that wants to delve a little bit deeper into the history that you bring us. So we've got a Return to Haunted Lowestoft and A Trial of Witches, and also a little bit less spooky, George Borrow, Alton and Beyond. And like I say, these are all available in Waterstones, or you could go into your local bookshop and order a copy of one or all of them, I would imagine.
Yeah. Although I wouldn't promote it, if there's people who are the Haunted Lowestoft, which also I'm sure a lot of you know, because I talked about it when we first started this. There's a lot of information, the detailed background to the trial of the Lowestoft witches in 1662. That's only available in the Beccles bookshop and Waterstones. You can't get it anywhere else. But I shouldn't say this, but if there's somebody who's particularly interested in ghost stories or Lowestoft or the Lowestoft witches and are nowhere near Lowestoft or Beccles, you can actually get it through Amazon as well. Although I don't encourage people to buy their books if they can get them locally through Amazon. It's better to go to the local bookshop. But if you're
people that are sort of isolated at home, though,
if you're in Canada, you're not going to catch the plane flight to Lowestoft to go to Waterstones and Beccles to get a copy, but you can get it on Amazon.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ivan, we're going to round it off and say thank you so much for another entertaining evening. I know everybody else feels the same. They've been mentioning it in their droves. Anybody that would like to, or perhaps caught it late, you always welcome to go back and review the broadcast, because it will be available on our Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. You can watch it again at your leisure. You can share it and share it wide amongst your friends and family and colleagues. And of course, you can also tune in to see Stephen and I on a Tuesday night. So that's tomorrow night. Every Tuesday night, we broadcast our Shanty sessions to a rogue Shanty chorus. Please do join us again next week for Ivan's talk on aspects of Gunton. Thanks, Ivan. You take care, and good night, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Good night. Bye. Thank you.